What if I told you that Charles Leclerc was completely shocked, not by what he felt behind the wheel, but by what he saw in another driver's data? Imagine that you have been the leader of Ferrari for half a decade, and that a newcomer not only gets into your car for the first time, but in minutes, in a limited test, shows you the true potential of a car that you thought you understood. Subscribe to continue uploading more of this type of content now, if we continue. That was exactly what happened in Fiorano on January 23rd, 2026. And since then, in Maranello, nothing is the same. That morning in Fiorano did not seem different from so many other days of private testing that Ferrari has carried out at its historic track. The gray sky, the humidity of the Emiliano winter, and the silence of the paddock only broken by the distant echo of the preparations. But beneath that routine appearance, something was brewing that would later be considered a turning point for the Scuderia. Lewis Hamilton, dressed for the first time in the red and white colors, walked towards the garage with the calm of someone who has already experienced everything in Formula One. At his side, Charles Leclerc, the most recognizable face of Ferrari in the last decade, showed a contained expression, perhaps a mixture of pride and caution. What differentiated this test from others was not the presence of the cameras, nor the logistical deployment, nor even the debut of the expected SF-26. It was the context that surrounded him. Ferrari was coming off a 2025 that had left deep scars. They had chosen to abandon development of the SF-25 mid-season, a radical decision that made it clear that the all-in bet was on 2026. In that environment of silent pressure, the shakedown at Fiorano was more than just a promotional shoot. It was an early evaluation. It was the first technical verdict of the project in which the entire factory had placed its future. The session was short, marked by the strict limitations imposed by the FIA for this type of event, restricting the total mileage to just 15 kilometers combined. But the brevity did not diminish its weight. Every lap counted, every meter traveled was analyzed in detail. Hamilton was the first to leave. His driving was meticulous, nothing spectacular from the outside, but internally, the car's sensors were collecting invaluable information. Leclerc took over minutes later, putting in an equally clean stint. No errors, without incident, but also without clear signs of the extraordinary. Everything seemed to be going well, but nothing stood out at first glance. It wasn't until they both returned to the box that the atmosphere began to change. The engineers, grouped in front of the screens, began to exchange glances. The telemetry of the car under Hamilton's driving showed patterns of stability and efficiency that had not been predicted in simulations. Leclerc, curious by nature, approached, noticed, and then he understood. No one needed to explain anything to him. He knew that car. He had spent weeks in the simulator. He had been an active part in the development feedback. And yet, in those few laps, Hamilton had extracted a level of performance that not even he himself had managed to replicate digitally. The surprise was genuine, and it wasn't toward Hamilton. He went towards the car. It was as if the SF-26, in the hands of the British, had revealed its true face. That was the moment when Maranello, without the need for statements, understood that this project was not more of the same. That something different was happening. That for the first time in many years, Ferrari could have created not only a competitive car, but a car that commanded respect, even from those who knew it better than anyone. The real earthquake did not occur on the runway. It happened minutes later when the engineers began processing the telemetry data and the pilots gathered in the engineering room. It was there that Charles Leclerc closely observed every technical parameter of Hamilton's laps. On a split screen, he could compare his records with those of the Briton corner by corner, brake by brake, power delivery by power delivery. What Leclerc saw was, simply put, unusual. But for someone of his caliber, who has spent years living with every nuance of the Maranello cars, it was almost disconcerting. The SF-26, which on paper already represented a break from the SF-25, performed in a way that not only exceeded the most optimistic internal simulations, but did so consistently in Hamilton's hands. The first data that stood out was the control in the middle phase of the curve. Hamilton managed to maintain a higher minimum speed without compromising exit stability, something that had been a chronic weak point in previous models. And it wasn't magic. It was technical. The seven-time champion applied a progressive braking pattern with an earlier transition to engine braking, which allowed him to keep the rear axle planted without having to compromise the entry angle. An approach that, in theory, had already been explored, but that Hamilton executed with surgical ease. Leclerc also noted the energy consumption values of the hybrid system. The MGUKS regeneration and subsequent delivery were noticeably more stable on Hamilton's lap, indicating that its traction management was reducing spin losses. In other words, Hamilton was not only faster, he was using the same machine more efficiently. And that, for a driver who has always been the technical face of Ferrari, was difficult to process. But the final blow was not a number. It was a gesture. Hamilton, upon getting out of the car, took out his cell phone and recorded the sound of the engine. Some interpreted it as a superficial, almost anecdotal action. However, in the engineering room, they knew that it was not a whim for the networks. It was an intimate gesture, one that spoke of respect, admiration, even surprise. For someone who has driven the most dominant Mercedes in history, who has tasted every nuance of technical success in this category, stopping for a moment to document what he had just felt was a powerful message. The SF-26, at least in that base configuration, had something worth remembering. Leclerc didn't say much at that moment, but the engineers saw him review his own records more carefully than usual. His silence was not frustration. It was a mix of fascination and urgency. For the first time, he was seeing another driver make the Ferrari talk in a way that he had not been able to, and that motivated him to look for answers. Not as someone who doubts his talent, but as someone who understands that the bar has just been raised. The most impressive thing was not that Hamilton was faster. It was that his driving revealed a hidden level of the car that no one, until that moment, had perceived. As if the car had been waiting for someone to speak to it in its language. And Hamilton did it, without apparent effort, without forcing, only connecting with the car from an understanding that Leclerc is still trying to decipher. What Leclerc experienced in Fiorano was not just an uncomfortable moment as a driver. It was in many ways an internal revelation that forced him to question not only his understanding of the car, but his role within Ferrari. For years, he had been the point of reference. The pilot who knew every corner of Maranello, every engineer, every simulator iteration, every development push. It was his perseverance in the technical darkness of recent years that partly sustained the Scuderia's sporting credibility. But that day, all that was displaced by a strange and unexpected feeling, that of being surpassed within one's own territory. The impact was not external. No one at Ferrari made public comparisons. There were no hurtful statements or gestures of favoritism towards Hamilton. The blow came from within when Leclerc, in front of the screens, clearly saw that his new teammate not only understood the car, but was showing a level of control over it that changed the scale of reference. And that, for a competitor of Charles's caliber, is deeply mobilizing. In the days following the test, Leclerc requested extended access to simulator data and requested additional virtual testing sessions. This wasn't wounded pride, but a deeper impulse, the urgent need to reinterpret the car from a new perspective. Hamilton had activated something at Ferrari that no one expected so soon, an acceleration in the team's collective learning curve. And Charles was not going to be left behind. The interesting thing is that this reaction was not destructive. It was not that of a driver defeated internally by the arrival of a superstar. It was that of someone who understands that the bar has been raised and that his only option is to grow. Therefore, his attitude changed subtly. He no longer spoke about the car as an unknown, but as a challenge. He began referring to the SF-26 not as promising, but as alive. Because now I knew that the car had more to give, and that the limit perhaps was not the car, but how much he himself was willing to evolve to extract it. When Charles Leclerc saw Hamilton's data that day at Fiorano, he didn't just witness a difference in style or experience. He witnessed the beginning of a new cycle. One that is not built with bombastic statements, but with dense silences, cross glances, and numbers that do not lie. Ferrari, for years, has lived between nostalgia for the past and the promise of a future that never came. But in those limited laps, under the cold Emilia-Romagna asphalt, something changed. Leclerc was not shocked out of fear. He was not intimidated by other people's talent. What hit him was the realization that Ferrari was no longer an abstract idea of wasted potential. It was finally a concrete reality. A reality that was not only felt at the wheel, but was measured in every bit of information. And that blow of reality, far from weakening him, strengthened him. Because in the elite of motorsports, competition is not a threat. It is an opportunity to rise. Hamilton, for his part, did not come to Ferrari with promises. He didn't talk about titles. It did not demand hierarchies. He simply got in the car and let the data speak for him. And in that simplicity, in that purity, lies its greatest impact. Because in a structure like Ferrari, which has historically oscillated between internal chaos and flashes of genius, the arrival of a driver who can organize dispersed talent through technical coherence represents much more than a star signing. It's a compass. Subscribe to continue uploading more of that content. Now you really think about all this.